Good evening and welcome to Critical Thoughts. I'm your host, Braxton Smith, and joining me tonight is co-host Jake Bird. Tonight we're going to be talking about fallacies and arguments, more specifically your formal fallacies. So basically what fallacies are flaws in the logic of arguments. And we're just going to take a handful of these. There's a whole slew of these. You can actually do your own research after watching this and read up on it a bit more, but basically, the skills we hope to present you with from this video would be shutting arguments down that have a false basis to it, a false premise to it. And actually, Jake's probably a little better explaining this because he's a little better versed. I'm going to be learning with a lot of you about some of these fallacies. So Jake, why don't you explain for everybody exactly what they can expect from this video?
Okay, well, as you were saying, fallacies are essentially falsehoods in any logical thought, and the whole point of logic is whatever premises you have, if they are true, the logical structure of your argument should preserve that truth and take it to the conclusion, which means that, if you have a valid logical structure and your premises are true, your conclusion cannot help but be true. And so, I think at least most people would agree truth is an important thing. We want to argue honestly and thoughtfully for anything that concerns us and that we think would better ourselves and better the people that we care about. And so trying to avoid and shut down any fallacies prevents falsehood from getting into the argument. It prevents muddying the waters and having foggy thinking. It helps us to sharpen the way we approach these things.
Yeah, it's basically what this whole page is founded on. It's not necessarily, not necessarily politics. It's just finding the best solutions to everything that involves any kind of thinking. And, obviously the object isn't to win the argument so much as enlighten ourselves. And, we like to forge our ideas and fire. And sometimes you have to engage with other people to make that happen. And oftentimes it's best to engage in people you don't agree with. It's like the old saying, I never learned anything from someone I agreed with. It's usually these disagreements that we learn from. So without further ado, I'm going to bring the first fallacy, one of the more common, easier ones I can bring up is the appeal to probability. It's to say that basically you're taking something for granted just because it is probable. For example, Jake was mentioning before we went on about the guy that's been struck by lightning multiple times. So it's to say that just because see, we have the article right here. So, it's like, we can't be, you can't get struck by lightning and then, okay, you damn sure can't get struck twice. Well, fact of the matter is it does happen from time to time. So, however small the probability, you can't necessarily rule out that outcome.
Yeah, and the converse is also true. No matter how sure you are you have a sure thing, we've all had those moments where it didn't pan out, even when we thought it would. So.
Yeah, kind of like when I so assuredly spoke out and said Hillary Clinton will most definitely win this election, and I had to eat my words on that. That's a really good example, actually. I must humbly admit. And something I got to disambiguate between, Jake, if you mind taking off the share screen for a moment, is disambiguate between the appeal to probability and one people like to bring up oftentimes is Occam's Razor, which is, the hypothetical answer with the fewest assumptions is most likely the correct answer. Again, a lot of people get that mistaken, and they'll say that's an appeal to probability because people take Occam's Razor as like an assertion that yes, this is the correct answer because there's the fewest assumptions. So you got to be careful. Occam's Razor is a good tool because you can say, well, most probably this is it because there's the fewest assumptions, but it's not a definite.
Yeah, Occam's Razor is basically the general term for what they call adductive logic, which is again trying to go with the most probable consequence or the most probable reasoning. And it's used in the scientific method all the time. You have this phenomenon that you're trying to explain, and you go, all right, with what we know, what is the most likely thing? And then you try to pursue that path because there's multiple options out there. You can have several theories to explain any one event, but eventually you're going to have to settle on one and at least try to persevere and follow it to its conclusions to actually see if it's right or wrong. So you just don't assume that it's correct, but you use that as a starting point.
Right. Okay. And so now, did you want to knock out one of yours, or did we say we're going to knock out the propositionals?
Yeah, I'll go with one of mine too. I'm going to go with like one of the more basic quantifying fallacies when dealing with numbers, and it's the false conversion. And the basic stating for that is, if all P are Q, therefore all Q are P. And, this is pretty basic, but we can, I see it all the time, and it's like, well, all the politicians in Alabama are conservative, therefore all conservatives are politicians. Obviously, that doesn't make sense, and it's taking different quantifiers and just mixing them up and acting as if there isn't like a hierarchical structure to the words you're presenting. Some things are members of a larger group. Sometimes they're part of two groups converging together. And we'll get into that a little bit more with the propositional logic. But, just because one thing is all one way doesn't mean everything goes all the way the other way.
All right. Okay. And so for the propositional, I actually got this handy-dandy drawing here. So there's actually 6 propositional fallacies. I just brought up the 3 popular ones anyways. And we're going to start with affirming disjunct. And that is basically to say that if you have A or B, and Jake actually has right there a Venn diagram, so you can actually like mathematically prove a fallacy. To me, that just blew my mind. I actually took a math course about a year ago where I found out like you can actually mathematically prove the flaw in someone's argument. And so this fallacy is to say that if this is true, if A is true, then B must be false, right? So where I've seen this fallacy, and this one's a little more personal to me, near and dear, I suppose, a little bit about myself. So, it's kind of a running joke going through dive school and ultimately becoming a diver. There's a statement: you're either a smart diver or you're a strong diver, and so there's always the running joke is if somebody does something stupid, you say, "Oh, well, you must be a strong diver." So obviously that it's kind of a joke in the sense it's kind of a little tongue in cheek, I guess you would say, and that understanding that yes, it is a fallacy. You can have a smart and strong diver, for example, but the whole joke goes one way or another. Or if you're in the weight room and homeboy can't lift it all, you say, "Oh, well, we know who the smart diver is." So, yeah, that's example 1. Now, moving on with the Venn diagram, we have affirming. Now, notice that these are all related to each other, too. Like I said, I'm only showing you 3 because they're all interconnected. So, affirming the consequent, that is to say, if A, then B. And so, in this situation, you say, okay, So, if A is true, the checks are terrible here, then B is true. Then, in this case, you say, well, if B is true, then A must be true. So, conversely. So, that is to say, imagine, if you will, A is a rainy day and B is a wet street. So, if a rainy day, then you're going to have a wet street. Well, that works that way, but if you switch it around this way, if wet street, then you're going to have a rainy day. Well, there's your logical fallacy, because, for all I know, I could be washing my car and now the street's wet. Doesn't necessarily mean there's ever rain or will be rain. So, moving on, you have something similar to that. It's a little different. Denying the antecedent. That is to say, if A, then B. Okay, so if not B, or if not A, then that is to assume not B. Okay, we go to the rainy day. If there's a rainy day, then you're going to have a wet street. And so if it's not a rainy day, then you're not going to have a wet street. Again, there's your logical fallacy, because yes, you can have a wet street. So without there being a rainy day. So what this all boils down to is, if you apply a lot of these, I've come to realize is it's really understanding these logical arguments. Usually, you through the power of logic and just applying these, you can actually usually come to your own logical conclusions without having to listen to somebody on the radio and get their opinions on it. Just common sense kind of logic applies there. But anyways, that's all I got for propositional. I don't mean to ramble here. All I got for propositional fallacies. Jake, what you had another couple, right?
Yeah. First one I'm going to go over is...
don't forget screen share. Or are you about to hit that up?
Nah, I'm not going to be using that anymore. It's another quantificational fallacy, and they call it the some are and some are not fallacy. And this also kind of has to play a lot like the affirming the disjunct with the or. There's usually a logical standard on how some of these words work, and then there's a parlance, how people speak. And they don't always line up. So with the some are not, there's the difference between implied and implicate. And with implied, that's the logical claim. When you imply something logically, that means it's true. You can get from point A to point B through a logical argument, and therefore you're making an affirmation of it. Implicate is like, I believe in God, or, God exists. If I say God exists, it kind of implicates that I believe that is true, even if I don't expressly state it. And the way this comes into problems is that, like, when you're trying to have an honest discussion, if you say some are and some are not, even though with whatever you're talking about, you know that all of them are, you're telling a half-truth. So an example would be, let's say there's a group of policemen and they're all accused of, just beating people, police brutality. And we've got a record of it, right? But, this might not be public knowledge. Maybe the DA's just sitting on it. And he comes out there and he's trying to be a politician about it because he doesn't want to foment too much distrust with the public. And he goes, well, of course some police are bad apples, but some are not. We can't just say that these people are those bad apples. He's telling the half-truth because he knows. He's got his records. And right now he's just trying to make sure people don't blow up about it. That's an engagement of the some are not, when you actually know that the whole truth is there is an exception in this case, but you're stating it as if there could be.
A real bootlicker, Jake. So, like, the same thing, you could apply that. You could say there's a logical fallacy about racism, for example. Like, if you were to imply, you expect certain attributes of people just based upon their race. Some people, there's always your exceptions. You can't just make a blanketed comment, right? Or am I?
Well, it's actually kind of the opposite of that. It's more like saying, well, some of the KKK are, notorious racists, but some might not be. It's like, no, it's kind of by definition in that case. It's kind of what the group's about. But, that one's trivial. The reason why I brought up the other one is when we're having a conversation, I might not know everything you know, and you might not know everything I know. So the importance of having a good communication is an honest one. But if you start admitting, well, I'm not for sure about this, or if you overstate your case, of course, this is how it always happens. When you know there are exceptions, then you're committing this fallacy.
Okay, well, there you go. Did you have, you had one more, right, before we move on to the finale?
Yeah, this one isn't as common, but I found it pretty interesting because just doing the research for this video is how I came across it, and it's called the masked man fallacy. And the way it goes is that, John is at this party, and he bumps into this masked stranger. The masked stranger is actually his father. Well, John knows his father, but he does not know the masked man, and they present it as a paradox. And the reason why this is a fallacy is because it makes the assumption that if you know somebody, you're omniscient when it comes to them. You know them past, present, and future, all forms, whether they're, under this pile of rags or whatever. As soon as you come across them, you've just got the radar pinged on them. You know them. And, obviously that's not the case. And, where you might see this in a courtroom is, a masked robber. Yeah, I saw this masked robber go in there. But was it this man over here, the defendant? Well, it's around the same size and shape. Oh, so you don't recognize him. It's not this guy, right? No. That man and the masked man can be totally the same. It will take more than just that witness's testimony, however, to prove the case, but that doesn't automatically mean you get to dismiss it or that conclusion is not true.
Okay. And I guess to wrap this up, getting towards the end of our time limit, I was going to go over my fun one. That was a pretty fun one. We're nerds. So my fun one was the fallacy, or fallacy squared, if you will. It's basically to say that, just because someone presents you an argument, just because that argument is fallacious doesn't mean that the conclusion is false. So the fallacy is you saying, well, you committed a fallacy, therefore you are ultimately wrong. It's like somebody can say, the answer could be 5. Okay, well, how did you arrive to that? Well, 2 plus 2 is 5. Okay, you're wrong there, but your ultimate answer is right. So, I don't know. That was my example. You got a better one, smarty pants?
Or, I know everyone's familiar with the internet culture. How many times have we heard, oh, that's a straw man, therefore, I want it. He used a straw man. It's like, ignore everything else that you said before in the paragraph and just focus on the insult. What? Like that was the only thing.
Yeah, so, and I guess the reason I chose that one is because I'm actually guilty of that pretty often myself. It's just get them to focus in on where they were fallacious and ignore all the rest. But sometimes all it is a straw man, especially if it's just a meme. But yeah, if somebody takes time and writes a paragraph, you can at least address the rest of it. But I guess I'm going to go ahead and give my final statement. Jake, you give yours, and then we'll sign off. But my little last 2 cents I got to put in here is, if you ever look between Jake and I when we post on Critical Thoughts, and if you actually ever looked at any of our personal posts, just an observation here. I'll debate somebody going on and on and on, and it's often because I entertain certain ideas. I'll let a few of these fallacies slip through the cracks, and the problem with that is that it opens up multiple variables to where now you have to pick out from all these possible outcomes because you entertained one impossible outcome as being possible. And so now you have to sift through all these, and just like Jake was talking about earlier, you muddy the water, and it makes, later on it kicks your ass, and it makes it so much more difficult to debate. And if you ever look at some of the debates Jake has, he's pretty good about just immediately addressing at the very beginning fallacious comments and just stopping it right there. And maybe you'll see a few more comments where somebody tries to squirm their way out of it, but ultimately you just can't argue it. It's like, bring out the Venn diagram. Here's mathematically where you are incorrect. Next proposition. Let's go. And some people walk away learning from it. I usually do. Sometimes I'm just too stubborn and I won't admit it. But I'll learn something. I'll walk away from it. I'll take something from it. But like I said, ideas forged in fire. This is all good for us. And Jake, you got any final comments?
Pretty much, again, these formal fallacies that we talked about now, it's all more about the logical structure. It doesn't even really have anything to do with the premises. It's about preserving the truth from premises to conclusion. A lot of these are simply, again, just not understanding logically how the words connect with the ideas. And, like with affirming the disjunct and stuff, sometimes it's just about A or B. Is it the logical or, where it's A, B, and A and B that are possibilities? Or is it like the strong or, where it's like, okay, you pick one and only one. You either get the slice of pizza or you get the hot dog. And that's another thing you have to really hone in on, is not just your logical structure, but making sure there's agreed upon premises as well. And, making sure you're not using linguistic shortcuts when you need to be a little bit more precise.
Guilty. All right. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the formal logical fallacies. Thanks again for tapping into Critical Thoughts, breaking through the white noise to bring you media that matters.